Chapter 4.44, Jax's Mother. When Miguel and I went through the hole in the wall, we were somehow in the corridor outside the main dining hall. How? I mouthed to Miguel, but he put his finger to his lips. Magic, he whispered, leading me into the dining hall. We sat down at an enormous table just as dinner was being served. Well, I say dinner, but that might make you think of roast potatoes and all sorts of delicious foods. But what was being dished up was a horrible, watery stew. My stomach almost shouted, "I will not eat this." I was so hungry and badly wanted one of Darling's meals. Bishop Thieves stood at the head of the dining hall and made us all say a weird prayer before we ate. He said it was an ancient spell, but none of us believed him. "A thievul spell," I whispered to Miguel, but he shook his head as if to say, "Shh." We all looked down and mumbled, "We thank the mysterious beasts of the deep and the gigantic reptiles of flight and all the things that stumble and creep, for this, the food we gladly eat." I couldn't help sighing as we all sat down. Hypocrisy is one of the worst things. Thievel pretended to be running an orphanage that gave hope to children who'd lost their parents, but the truth was he was one of the most cruel men in the land, and he used fake magic and fake religion to cover up his crimes. As we were about to start eating, there was a loud knocking at the main doors of the dining hall. I could see that Thievel was furious and terrified all at once. Knowing that made something inside me feel brave and full of hope. Amos the cleaner opened the doors and a tall ice witch entered the room, holding a staff made from ice and fire. Where she held the staff was as clear as glass, but the top of it emitted a constant stream of flames. Thievel stood up and held out his right hand. "Stop right there! You are not welcome," he roared. "You know that you are not allowed to use your inferior female magic." "Inferior?" bellowed the ice witch. "That's my mum," whispered Jax. Minnow's eyes widened. "I didn't recognise her," whispered Sky. "She's in her magisterial mode," said Jax quietly. "I love her," said Minnow. "She's magnificent," I said. Sky grinned. "Spectacular." Jax held her head high. "Well, she did train Stella to be a time pirate," she whispered. Sky's smile widened. "Oh, I love her even more." Jax looked very happy. "She's the best." Jax's mother held her staff high above her head and said, "Only those who are kind may speak." Thievel tried to shout, but his mouth kept opening and shutting like a fish. Not a word would come out. "Now," said Jax's mum, "my name is Asmax Matrix, and I'd like anyone who can speak to say good evening to me on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, shouted Jax. "Good evening, Asmax Matrix," shouted most of the room. "Good evening, students of Mudfog," said Jax's mother, "although I must say I'd very much like to change the name of this school to the Ice and Fire School of Magic for all girls and boys." With that, Asmax Matrix held her staff high above her head, and it started spinning around. We all stared up as its flames spread in a circle above us. While the circle of flames hung in the air, glorious food appeared on our tables. Strawberries and cream, plump cherries, the best toasted sandwiches, mountains of curry and rice, steaming naan bread, plates of sushi, the best pies, piles of salad, and lots of iced gelati, massive tubs of the stuff. Oh, and chocolate truffles, the sort that melt in your mouth. "Tuck in," said Asmax in a loud voice, "and you can eat dessert first if you want to." There was loud cheering, and after that every child in the room hooted and laughed. "Bishop Thieve and I have some things to discuss," said Jax's mum. "Well, we will talk when I return his power of speech, and if any of the rest of you can't speak, I'd suggest that you consider being a lot more kind in future. There's nothing worse than people who think it's okay to be mean." One boy, who was clearly unable to speak, made a loud, rude noise behind Asmax's back. "I heard that," she said, spinning around to look at the boy. "Barney Blesso, I've met your sons. Do you Blessos never learn? For being rude, you can have a bullfrog voice for 1 full day and 1 full night." Barney Blesso opened his mouth to protest, but instead of words, out came a loud croak. The hall erupted into laughter, and Barney pulled one of his fists back, threatening to punch the boys near him. Asmax was having none of it. She pointed her staff at Barney, and he shrank down to the size and shape of a bullfrog. "Now, any of you who harm this bullfrog will be sorry," she said. "But Barney, when you get your voice and your body back, think twice before you ever become unkind again, because once an ice witch has turned you into a bullfrog, this will happen every single time you misbehave. So, as they say, play nice." Jax grinned. "Oh, yes," she whispered. Suddenly, a black and white border collie raced into the dining room, barking and leaping up onto the dining tables to steal food. Around and around the room she raced, with Thievel's goons trying to catch her. Finally, she came up onto our table and leapt into Magal's arms. "Hey, Blizz," whispered Magal. I patted Panda's head, so glad that Blizzard's spirit had a way to escape from Thievel's grasp. Asmax swept over to our table. "You boys look like a kind lot," she said. "Dogs always know a kind heart when they sense it. Extra gelati for all of you, and some hot chocolates too. And for you, dear one, some fresh bones." As she waved her staff over our table, Asmax winked at Jax, who winked right back. Asmax turned around to look at everyone in the dining hall. "If anyone harms this creature," she said, pointing to Panda, "I will turn that person into a bullfrog forever. Understood?" Still unable to speak, Thieve made a terrible noise in his throat. Asmax pointed her staff at him. "Understood?" she asked again. "Nod your head right now, or I will give you a day in the life of a bullfrog." Thieve nodded reluctantly. Asmax turned back to Jax and grinned. "Now," said Asmax, "Thieve, would you like your voice back? We need to have a little chat about a young friend of mine called Mitchell Blizzard." Chapter 4.444, Asmax and Blizzard. Asmax turned back to our table and gestured at me. "You," she said, and then she pointed at Jax. "And you, when you've finished your meal, come and join us. You can be my witnesses to testify that I haven't misbehaved with Thieve." We both nodded, but Thievel looked like he was going to burst. "And you," she added, giving Frank a recording device. "You can film the whole thing so that we have a record of events. Now, Thieve, are you going to behave?" asked Asmax, looking at Mudfog's principal. He nodded, but I knew he wouldn't be happy about being bossed around by Jax's mum. Asmax touched him on the lips with the edge of her staff, and suddenly Bishop Thieve could speak. "How dare you?" he asked in a low voice. "Very easily," said Asmax. "You've been harming a boy who happens to be my godchild." "Your godchild," said Thievel with a scowl. "Mitchell Blizzard," said Asmax. "I'd like to see him." "He's unavailable," snapped Thievel. No one's unavailable, said Asmax. He's been misbehaving, said Thievel. Asmax threw back her shoulders and stood very tall. Are you recording this? She asked Frank. Yes, he said, barely able to breathe. He was so in awe of Jax's mum. Good, said Asmax. We'll be sending this recording to the Vice-Chancellor of all education in the land of ice and fire. You will not, said Thievel. Asmax towered over him. I most certainly will, she said. Now tell me, where is Mitchell Blizzard? He's in the dungeons, said Thievel, as punishment. In a dungeon? Asked Asmax, looking furious. Take me to him immediately. Thievel stood up and roared at Asmax. Streams of green fire flew from his mouth and almost burned all of us, but Asmax turned Thievel into ice and then span her staff into the air again. While my staff spins, she said in a loud voice, anyone still thinking unkind thoughts will be frozen. Several boys turned to ice and some of the teachers did it as well. Now, she said, still standing tall, don't be afraid. Even so, nearly everyone in the dining hall was staring at Asmax in terror. I am here to visit my godson, she continued. Once I've done that, I'll release the unkind among you from their frozen state. As for the rest of you, well done for being kind. Now finish your meals and wait for my return. All the boys were stunned and simply nodded. I'm putting you in charge, said Asmax, pointing to Jax. I need to go to the dungeons to visit Blizzard. Miguel stood up. Excuse me, he said, but could I show you the way with my helper, Ben? Asmax frowned. Do I know you? She asked. No, said Miguel, but I know one of your students, Evie Coco Anne. Asmax's face melted into a smile. Evie Coco Anne, she said, one of my favourite wizards. Where is she? Bishop Thieve threatened to have her killed for teaching me about kindness, said Miguel. What? He says that her magic is female and of a lesser form. Asmax roared. Anyone here who has been told that female magic is inferior, please watch this. Jax's mum pointed her staff at Bishop Thieve. He was already frozen, but under the power of the indigo streams of light coming from Asmax's staff, the bishop rose into the air and became stuck to the ceiling like a stalactite in a cave. As we all watched, more and more ice formed around him. Everyone was amazed, and some of the younger boys cheered. Silence, said Asmax loudly. It is not right to disrespect your principal, but he's not my principal, so I am allowed to. Either way, do not worry. He will not be your principal for very much longer, not if I have anything to do with it. Now, behave while I'm in the dungeons. Miguel and Ben, lead the way. Frank, you come too. I need all of this to be recorded. Turning back to Jax, she added, Jack, is that your name? Jax nodded with a smile. You and everyone at your table, said Asmax, can be in charge until I return.